we've walked through that dynamic where the United States has the ability to always to provide dollars for people who call in their so-called debts. But what about, I mean, and we don't hear this quite as much as we did 5 years ago when we were talking about this, or even 6 or 7 years ago. Well, I was told by now we would be Weimar Germany, and that when I go down to get my sandwich, it's going to cost me $75 to buy, like, a loaf of bread or something. Why didn't that happen? And why won't it happen if we behave or have the understanding that you are suggesting?
Okay, so, well, why wouldn't something like that happen, what you're describing, a hyperinflationary scenario? I think what a lot of people were worried about 4 or 5 years ago, 6 maybe years ago, was what the Fed was doing. Not so much what Congress was doing, although maybe some of that, because deficits got really big in the wake of the financial crisis during the recession. I mean, we had trillion-dollar deficits, which are more than double the normal size of the public sector deficit. So maybe people were concerned about the size of the deficit causing inflation. But there was also a lot of concern, you remember, about what the Fed was doing, all that quantitative easing, and people were calling Bernanke Helicopter Ben, and there were cartoons of money being dropped from the sky, and this was all supposed to lead to massive inflation. So I guess there are a couple of ways to think about it. One is what causes inflation in the economy. The U.S. just has not experienced any kind of serious inflation since really the 1970s. And globally, what countries are struggling with right now is not any kind of inflationary pressure, but all across the world, governments are struggling to just keep inflation in positive territory. In other words, to avoid deflation. And so inflation remains very, very low in spite of the fact that governments ran these big deficits, and you had all these central banks doing quantitative easing and other sorts of things, printing money, so to speak. So if we can't get inflation up, and central bankers have been very frustrated, at their inability to get inflation up to their 2% target even, then one question is, maybe it's just not that easy to generate inflation. I mean, if it were that easy to do, surely we would have been successful by now. I mean, $3.5 trillion increase in the Fed's balance sheet and so forth. So I don't think it's all that easy, and I think inflation is one of these phenomena that economists do not understand very well. The last time we had significant inflation in the U.S., again, was in the 70s, and we had oil price shocks.
Yes.
So, that kind of thing is easier to understand. But just running an economy at full employment, taking advantage of the policy space you have, and trying to use the government's budget to achieve broader objectives in the economy like full employment isn't going to get you inflation problem.
And so the idea, I mean, as I understood the fear at that time was the Fed was essentially, creating money out of thin air, which is, I don't know how else you would do it, really.
Exactly.
I mean, but they were creating money out of thin air, just like you would suggest that, Congress created money out of thin air when they voted to raise the military budget by $80 billion. It's not like anybody went into, into the bowels of the Senate and started with a pickaxe and started, pulling this stuff out. And the idea is that, I mean, that fear, as I understand it, is that our monetary policy would create inflation, as opposed to sort of like the market where you have, oil shocks and you have a tremendous demand that outstrips the supply, and then all of a sudden people are paying more for something, and that's driving inflation. Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos